So the next thing we're talking about is delegation. Delegation is a major area of potential for malpractice, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. So delegation is transferring the authority to complete a task while still retaining responsibility for ensuring that it is done correctly. Delegation includes supervision. So when we decide to delegate, what are some things that we need to consider? First of all, we need to know, are there laws and rules to support delegation of this task to that person? Is it within the scope of the person delegating it? I can't delegate something that's not in my scope. I cannot delegate a task that as a licensed RN, I could not do myself. So is it within the scope of the delegating nurse? Does the patient need any assessment as part of this task? Because that's going to determine who it can be delegated to. If assessment is required, then we can't delegate to an unlicensed person, and we need to consider whether we can delegate to an LPN. Is the delegating nurse competent to make the decision about delegating to that individual? So if that's not the case, then maybe the delegating nurse needs to seek some assistance with that decision. So the last thing is that task within the delegate's range of functions? So is it within the scope of practice of the person we're delegating to? So these are some general guidelines you need to know for each, for the potential. So for unlicensed assistive personnel, CNA, PCA, aide, tech, whatever, is all kind of lumped into, since a lot of different facilities have different names for that and different job descriptions, anyone who works in direct patient care who does not have a license, it's all put together as UAP, or unlicensed assistive personnel. So get used to that acronym, because you're going to see it in your books, you're going to see it in tests. That's probably how it's going to be on NCLEX. So UAP. An unlicensed care person or an unlicensed assistive personnel can do a task that frequently recurs in daily care, that has an established sequence of steps, requires little or no modification from patient to patient, has a predictable outcome, does not involve assessment, interpretation, decision-making, which cannot be separated from the task, and does not endanger the patient. So let's talk about that for just a little bit. So we know that CNAs give baths, right? So CNA can give a bath because it's something that recurs frequently in daily care. It has an established sequence of steps. It doesn't require a lot of modification. They're usually taught the specific modifications they need to make. It has a predictable outcome, and they don't have to assess or interpret any information or make decisions during that bath time. Now, can we delegate the bath of an unstable patient to a CNA? In COVID, my students and I have had some patients who were post-COVID or who had other reasons for being unstable, who were either hemodynamically or their respiratory status was unstable. And so as we bathed them, we had to be assessing their O2 sats or their pulse to determine if we could continue that bath. That's not an appropriate bath to delegate to a CNA. Okay. It's done all the time, but it's not appropriate. So even tasks that are typically within the scope of practice may be inappropriate if more assessment is required. So CNAs can, or UAPs, sorry. If UAPs cannot assess, then how can they do vital signs and measure INOs? Because they can collect data, the analysis of that data can be separated from the data. So a CNA can be taught and is taught how to correctly obtain vital signs. Okay. They don't have to be able to interpret those vital signs or make decisions about them in order to be able to correctly measure vital signs. The same thing with I&O. A CNA can measure the amount of fluid going into and out of a person through the day. They cannot make determinations about what that means. So if your CNAs are getting your I&Os and getting your vital signs, you are responsible as the nurse for knowing what those are and addressing them. Okay. The big thing is anything we delegate to a UAP cannot be something that could endanger the patient. Okay, so LPN or LVN scope of practice varies by state. Some general guidelines, and you'll need to keep these guidelines in mind for testing purposes, but also to protect your license, is that stable patients can be delegated to LPNs, routine nursing care, and the ongoing plan of care. LPNs do assessment. LPNs do a lot of assessment, but an LPN should not be doing the initial assessment at admission to a facility. That needs to be done by an RN. And if an LPN finds a change or a concerning finding in assessment, then they need to report that to an RN. Now, how many of you have reported a concern on your assessment to an RN and the RN didn't address it? So it can be really, really challenging when what you know needs to be done is outside your legal scope. And so that can be a real challenge. But if as an LPN, you note a change in findings, the RN is supposed to follow up on that with you. Okay. So we also need to know, not only is this task in the legal scope of practice of that individual, but does that individual have the knowledge, skills, and abilities required? So that goes back to my example with checking the blood glucose. Blood glucose measurement bedside blood glucose is a task that can be routine, doesn't have potential to harm the patient. It doesn't need to be modified from patient to patient. It doesn't involve any assessment or interpretation. So it can be delegated to someone who's unlicensed. But if we delegate that to someone who's unlicensed, who has not been taught to use the glucometer correctly, that's not an appropriate delegation. So they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities. Are there policies and procedures in place that support that delegation, and is appropriate supervision available? The 5 rights of delegation: there's the right task, the right circumstances, the right person, the right direction and communication, and the right supervision and evaluation. This is modeled after the 5 rights of med administration. There are 5 rights of delegation. So how do we find out what the right task is? That information would be in state nurse practice acts and employee job descriptions, on skills checklists. As a student, that's why you have to have your skills checklist with you. And documented, demonstrated competency. So that would be why facilities have competency fairs, where you go in, demonstrate all the skills, they check it off, then they've got in your file, this nurse is competent to start IVs. This nurse is competent to place NG tubes. What can we not delegate? We cannot delegate assessment and identification of nursing problems to anyone without a license. Okay, we cannot delegate care planning to anyone without a license. We cannot delegate teaching or counseling to anyone without a license, and we cannot delegate therapeutic nursing techniques to anyone without a license. LPNs legally can perform follow-up or focused assessment. They can update the care plan, they can reinforce teaching, and they can care for stable patients. Unlicensed personnel can collect data, they can perform tasks as directed within their scope, and they can perform routine tasks. So the number of times I've said those things should be a cue that you need to really understand those guidelines, because there will be questions about whether an action is appropriate or not to delegate. The right circumstances. Is the setting appropriate? Are there resources available? Are there any other factors? So baths are typically delegated to UAPs. But remember, we talked about the circumstances of a bath when the patient maybe has is in respiratory distress, that maybe that patient is not stable enough. The right person, not only does it need to be within their scope of practice, but we need to consider strengths and weaknesses. We need to consider how many other tasks assigned. Have any of you ever been working on a unit when all the nurses were caught up charting, not doing, or maybe some nurses are caught up charting and don't have anything to do, but the CNA is just running their legs off because all the patients on the floor are total care. We need to think about what other tasks that person has assigned, and are we overloading them? Because if we are, then something's not going to get done or not going to get done correctly. And any other related needs of the patient. The right direction and communication, we need to be clear, concise, give correct information, and complete. So a lot of times, especially unlicensed personnel, have a routine that they follow, and so they may not be getting direct delegation from the nurse. But if I, as a nurse, I don't want to interrupt the routine, but if I, as a nurse, need to know if a patient's vital signs are outside of a range that maybe isn't the standard reporting range, I might go to that CNA and ask, can you let me know if her pulse goes up at all? Okay, can you let me know if her temp is 99? So I want to be very clear about that. And there have been times that I may have asked a CNA to assess vital signs more, or to not assess, to measure vital signs more frequently on a patient and bring them to me because I was concerned about what's going on with the patient. You need to communicate that clearly, concisely, completely. Make sure you're communicating correct information. And the right supervision and evaluation, that means making sure that the task was completed correctly, giving feedback as needed. So if we need to give feedback to someone that we're delegating to, we want to ask for their input first. How do you think that went? Give credit for their effort and for what they've done correctly. Share your perceptions. If something wasn't done correctly, share your perceptions, but we need to do that in a non-judgmental, neutral way. Explore the differences, ask for a plan of improvement. What do you think we can do to improve this for the next time? Agree on a plan and revisit the plan. Okay, the next video is going to be about confidentiality.